War is often remembered as a slow, grinding process. Trenches, stalemates, months of bloodshed for a few meters of land. But in the early years of the Second World War, the world witnessed something terrifyingly different. A new way of fighting. A method so fast, so coordinated, that entire nations collapsed before they could understand what was happening. This was Blitzkrieg, Lightning War. In this video, you will witness how Blitzkrieg was conceived, how it worked in brutal detail, and how it changed modern warfare forever. You will hear real accounts from soldiers, civilians, and commanders who lived through the shock of armored columns, screaming dive bombers, and total collapse in a matter of days. This is not a myth. This is not propaganda. These are real facts from real battlefields, where speed became a weapon as deadly as any bomb. If you enjoy these war journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought in the comments below. This helps others find their way here too. For now, let's begin our journey. Blitzkrieg was not just about tanks or planes. It was about psychology, fear, disorientation, the destruction of command structures before the enemy could react. It was war designed to break not only armies, but minds. To understand Blitzkrieg, we must first understand the problem it was created to solve. After the First World War, Germany was a defeated nation. The Treaty of Versailles stripped it of territory, military power, and dignity. The German army was limited to 100,000 men. Tanks were forbidden. Aircraft were forbidden. For many officers, this humiliation was not the end of German military thinking. It was the beginning of something new. Among these officers were men like Heinz Guderian, a signals officer who believed that speed and communication would define future wars. Guderian studied the failures of trench warfare and reached a simple conclusion. Wars of attrition favored industrial giants. Germany could not afford that. If Germany were to fight again, it would have to win quickly or not at all. This idea was not uniquely German. British theorists like J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart had already written about armored warfare and rapid maneuvers. But while Britain debated and hesitated, Germany listened. German officers secretly trained with tanks in the Soviet Union, evading treaty restrictions. They experimented, they failed, they learned. By the early 1930s, a dangerous synthesis had formed. Tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, engineers, and air power, all coordinated through radios, all moving as a single striking force. This was revolutionary. Traditional armies still treated tanks as infantry support weapons. Blitzkrieg treated them as the spearhead. Instead of spreading tanks along the front, Germany concentrated them. Entire armored divisions would punch through a narrow point, ignoring enemy strongholds, leaving slower infantry to clean up later. Once a breakthrough was achieved, speed became everything. German tanks did not stop. They did not wait for orders delivered by messengers. Radios allowed commanders to adapt instantly. If resistance appeared, it was bypassed. If an opportunity emerged, it was exploited immediately. This constant movement shattered enemy plans before they could even be executed. But tanks alone were not enough. Above the battlefield, a Luftwaffe played a crucial role. Dive bombers like the U-87 Stuka became symbols of terror. Their sirens, known as Jericho trumpets, were designed to induce panic as much as destruction. Soldiers and civilians alike described the sound as unbearable, a screaming warning that death was seconds away. Blitzkrieg relied on close air support, something rarely practiced before. Aircraft were not just strategic bombers, they were flying artillery, attacking enemy columns, headquarters, bridges, and railways in real time. Communication between ground and air units allowed for unprecedented coordination. The result was chaos. Enemy commanders often lost contact with their units within hours. Telephone lines were cut, headquarters were bombed, Reserves were destroyed before reaching the front. Entire divisions found themselves surrounded without understanding how it had happened. One Polish officer later wrote that the battlefield felt liquid, constantly changing, impossible to grasp. Soldiers reported fighting enemies they could not see, attacked from directions that should have been impossible. This was exactly the point. Blitzkrieg aimed to collapse the enemy's ability to think and react. Once confusion took hold, resistance crumbled rapidly. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 was the first full demonstration of Blitzkrieg in action. German forces attacked from multiple directions, coordinating armored thrusts with air superiority. Polish cavalry, often mythologized, were not foolishly charging tanks, but they were hopelessly outmatched by speed and firepower. Warsaw was bombed relentlessly. Refugee columns clogged roads, slowing Polish movements, while German units bypassed them entirely. Within weeks, Poland was defeated. The world was shocked, but many believed it was an exception. France, after all, was different. It had the Maginot Line. It had more tanks than Germany. It had experienced commanders and a massive army. Yet in May 1940, Blitzkrieg struck again, and this time, the consequences were even more devastating. German forces attacked through the Ardennes, a region the Allies considered impassable for tanks. French doctrine assumed any attack there would be slow and easily countered. They were wrong.
German armored columns moved day and night. Engineers built bridges under fire. Luftwaffe bombers paralyzed Allied responses. French units received orders that were outdated by the time they arrived. One French officer recalled receiving instructions to defend a position already occupied by German tanks. Within days, the German army reached the English Channel, trapping hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers in Belgium and northern France. The evacuation at Dunkirk became necessary not because of tactical defeat alone, but because strategic surprise had rendered the situation hopeless. Blitzkrieg had not merely beaten the Allies, it had outpaced them. But behind the success lay enormous risks. Blitzkrieg demanded flawless coordination. If supply lines were cut, armored spearheads could be isolated and destroyed. German tank crews often operated with minimal sleep, surviving on adrenaline and fear. Breakdowns were constant, fuel shortages were common, yet the momentum carried them forward. German soldiers described a strange duality, exhilaration at the speed of victory and terror at how exposed they were. One panzer commander wrote that at times he felt like a gambler who has bet everything on one throw of the dice. This gamble defined Blitzkrieg. It was not invincible. It relied on weak enemy coordination, air superiority, and favorable terrain. When these conditions disappeared, Blitzkrieg faltered, a lesson that would become brutally clear on the Eastern Front. But in its early years, Blitzkrieg rewrote the rules of war. It proved that wars could be decided not by years of attrition, but by days of movement. That command, communication, and morale were as decisive as numbers. And that fear, properly weaponized, could collapse nations faster than artillery ever could. Blitzkrieg was often described as an unstoppable force, but in reality it was a fragile system held together by speed, discipline, and relentless pressure. Behind the dramatic breakthroughs and rapid advances lay a complex structure of doctrines, improvisation, and calculated risks that few outside the German command truly understood at the time. One of the most misunderstood facts about Blitzkrieg is that Germany did not possess superior tanks at the beginning of the war. In 1939 and 1940, many German panzer models were lightly armored and undergunned compared to their French and British counterparts. The Panzer I and II, which formed a large portion of the armored force, were never intended to fight enemy tanks directly. They were vulnerable, noisy, and thin-skinned. What compensated for this weakness was coordination. German tank units were organized not as isolated weapons, but as components of a living system. Every panzer division included infantry transported in trucks, artillery units capable of rapid deployment, engineers trained to clear obstacles, and reconnaissance elements constantly probing ahead. Most importantly, nearly every German tank was equipped with a radio. This single technological choice changed everything. While Allied tanks often relied on hand signals or messengers, German commanders could issue orders instantly. A battlefield that once moved at the speed of runners now moved at the speed of sound. This allowed German units to react to resistance, exploit gaps, and coordinate attacks faster than any opponent could match. Radio discipline was drilled relentlessly. Crews were trained to communicate clearly, briefly, and constantly. Silence was considered dangerous. One German officer noted that a silent unit was often a dead unit. Blitzkrieg also relied heavily on reconnaissance, a fact often overshadowed by images of tanks charging forward. Motorcycle troops, armored cars, and light infantry moved ahead of the main force, identifying weak points, undefended bridges, and enemy headquarters. When resistance was found to be strong, it was not confronted head-on. Instead, it was marked, bypassed, and isolated. This created pockets of enemy forces that were technically undefeated, but strategically irrelevant. Encirclement was not an accident, it was the goal. The German term Kesselschlacht, or cauldron battle, described this perfectly. Enemy units were surrounded, cut off from supplies and communication, and slowly crushed or forced to surrender. Often, the psychological pressure alone was enough. Soldiers inside these pockets reported confusion, hunger, and a sense of abandonment that destroyed morale long before ammunition ran out. The Luftwaffe amplified this effect. Contrary to popular belief, Blitzkrieg was not primarily about strategic bombing of cities. It focused on tactical air power. German aircraft targeted bridges, rail junctions, fuel depots, and command centers. The goal was not destruction for its own sake, but paralysis. Real accounts from French and Belgian officers repeatedly describe headquarters being bombed just as orders were being drafted, leaving entire sectors without leadership. One French general later admitted that his unit lost cohesion not because of defeat in battle, but because it ceased to exist as a command structure. The infamous Stuka dive bomber played a key role in this psychological warfare. Although slow and vulnerable, its precision was unmatched early in the war. Stuka pilots were trained to attack with terrifying accuracy, diving steeply towards targets before releasing bombs at low altitude. The screaming sirens attached to the aircraft were not military necessities, they were psychological weapons. Civilians described panic spreading faster than the bombs themselves. Soldiers recalled freezing in place, convinced they were about to die. Fear became a force multiplier. Another critical but rarely discussed aspect of Blitzkrieg was logistics. Speed meant nothing without fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. German supply units worked under extreme pressure, often driving through unsecured territory to keep the advance alive. Fuel shortages were constant. Panzer commanders frequently reported halting operations not because of enemy resistance, but because their tanks were running dry. Improvisation became standard practice. Captured enemy fuel was used whenever possible. Mechanics worked under fire, cannibalizing damaged vehicles to keep others running. One German quartermaster wrote that Blitzkrieg consumed fuel the way fire consumes air. Despite these challenges, the momentum was often enough to maintain the illusion of invincibility. The enemy, seeing columns of tanks advancing relentlessly, assumed German strength was unlimited. In reality, many spearhead units were stretched to the breaking point. A single determined counterattack at the right moment could have severed supply lines and destroyed entire divisions. This vulnerability was evident during the Battle of France. At several moments, German armored units outran their infantry support. French commanders briefly considered counterattacking the exposed flanks, but hesitation, confusion, and fear prevented decisive action. By the time orders were issued, the opportunity was gone. Blitzkrieg thrived on enemy indecision.
Another fascinating fact is that Blitzkrieg was never an official, fully codified doctrine at the start of the war. The term itself was popularized by journalists, not the German military. German planners spoke instead of Bewegungskrieg, war of movement. This lack of rigid doctrine allowed flexibility. Commanders were encouraged to act independently, adapting to the situation on the ground.
This philosophy, known as Auftragstaktik, meant that officers were given objectives rather than detailed instructions. If a commander found a better path to the objective, he was expected to take it. This empowerment of lower-level officers created speed not just in movement, but in decision-making. While Allied commanders waited for approval from higher headquarters, German officers were already acting. However, this same flexibility could lead to chaos. Friendly fire incidents were not uncommon. Units sometimes advanced so quickly that maps became useless. Several German tank units accidentally collided with each other in the fog of war, mistaking fellow soldiers for the enemy. Blitzkrieg was controlled chaos, effective but dangerous. The human cost was immense. Civilians were often caught between advancing forces and retreating armies. Roads filled with refugees became obstacles and targets. German columns sometimes bypassed entire towns, leaving civilians uncertain who controlled their territory. French civilians described seeing German tanks appear out of nowhere, followed hours later by infantry, then silence. Authority vanished. Law collapsed. Rumors spread faster than facts. For soldiers on the receiving end, Blitzkrieg felt overwhelming. British troops retreating toward Dunkirk described constant air attacks, sudden appearances of armored units, and a sense that the enemy was everywhere at once. Sleep was rare. Fatigue eroded discipline. Units dissolved not through defeat, but exhaustion. German soldiers, meanwhile, experienced a different psychological strain. Victory came so fast that reflection was impossible. Many soldiers later admitted they did not fully understand what they were participating in. Orders came, roads passed beneath them, resistance collapsed, and suddenly they were hundreds of kilometers from where they had started. One Panzer crewman wrote years later that Blitzkrieg felt like being inside a storm that you could not escape, even if you wanted to. By mid-1940, Blitzkrieg had reshaped global military thinking. Nations rushed to study German methods. Armies reorganized. Radios became standard. Combined arms warfare became the new norm. Yet the very success of Blitzkrieg planted the seeds of its limitations. It depended on surprise, on weak enemy coordination, on air superiority, and above all, on short campaigns. When wars dragged on, when supply lines stretched too far, when the enemy adapted, Blitzkrieg lost its sharpest edge. These weaknesses would soon be exposed in the vast spaces of the Soviet Union. By the summer of 1941, Blitzkrieg had become more than a military method. It had become a belief system. German commanders, politicians, and soldiers alike were convinced that speed and shock could defeat any enemy, anywhere. This confidence would soon be tested on a scale never before imagined. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was the largest military offensive in human history. Millions of men, thousands of tanks, and vast fleets of aircraft surged eastward in a campaign designed to annihilate the Red Army in a matter of weeks. The plan relied on Blitzkrieg principles: rapid advances, massive encirclements, and the collapse of Soviet command structures before they could recover. At first, it worked. German armored spearheads tore through border defenses. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Prisoner columns stretched for kilometers. German soldiers wrote home describing victories so large they were impossible to comprehend. One officer recorded capturing more prisoners in a single week than his regiment had faced during the entire campaign in France. The Soviet Union was unprepared in leadership and deployment. Stalin's purges had decimated experienced officers. Communication was poor. Units were often ordered to stand and fight until annihilated. Blitzkrieg thrived in this environment of rigidity and confusion. Yet even in victory, cracks were forming. The distances of the Soviet Union were unlike anything the German army had encountered. Roads were primitive, railways used a different gauge, supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers across hostile territory. Tanks advanced faster than fuel and ammunition could follow. German logistical reports from July 1941 described units immobilized not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. The weather became an enemy as well. Summer dust clogged engines and blinded drivers. Vehicles broke down at alarming rates. Mechanics worked around the clock, cannibalizing wrecks to keep a fraction of tanks operational. By August, some panzer divisions had lost more vehicles to mechanical failure than to combat. Despite these challenges, the encirclements continued. At Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev, German forces achieved some of the largest cauldron battles in history. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured. From a tactical perspective, Blitzkrieg was still devastating, but strategically, something had changed. The Soviet Union did not collapse. Instead of surrendering, it absorbed losses and continued fighting. New armies formed. Factories were relocated east beyond German reach. Soviet commanders began to learn. They traded space for time, refusing to be destroyed in decisive battles. This adaptation undermined Blitzkrieg's core assumption that the enemy would break before Germany did. German soldiers began to sense the shift. Advances slowed, resistance stiffened, counterattacks increased. Soviet tanks, particularly the T-31, shocked German crews. Its sloped armor, wide tracks, and powerful gun outclassed most German designs of the time. One German tanker wrote years later that facing a T-31 for the first time was like meeting a weapon from the future. The Luftwaffe, so dominant in earlier campaigns, struggled to maintain air superiority over vast distances. Aircraft were worn down, pilots were exhausted. Soviet air power, once shattered, re-emerged. Blitzkrieg required constant pressure. Any pause allowed the enemy to regroup. By autumn, the pace had slowed dramatically. Then came the mud. The Rasputitsa, the seasonal mud of Russia, turned roads into swamps. Tanks sunk to their hulls. Trucks became immobile. Horses replaced vehicles in many supply units. German soldiers described dragging equipment by hand, their boots sucked into the earth. Speed, the essence of Blitzkrieg, vanished. As winter approached, German units found themselves ill-equipped for extreme cold. Engines froze, weapons jammed, soldiers lacked proper clothing, frostbite casualties mounted. Meanwhile, Soviet resistance hardened.
At Moscow, Blitzkrieg finally met its limits. German forces, exhausted and overstretched, were halted just short of their objective. Soviet counteroffensives pushed them back, shattering the myth of German invincibility. For the first time, Blitzkrieg had failed to deliver a decisive victory. This failure was not due to a single mistake, but to the environment it faced. Blitzkrieg was designed for short campaigns against fragile command systems. It was not designed for endless space, resilient industry, and a population willing to endure catastrophic losses. The German command responded by doubling down. Rather than abandoning Blitzkrieg, they tried to refine it. Heavier tanks were developed, anti-tank weapons improved, tactical adaptations emerged. Yet the fundamental problem remained. Speed alone could not win a war of attrition. The Eastern Front became a grinding struggle. Encirclements still occurred, but they were smaller and costlier. Soviet forces learned to retreat before being trapped. German losses mounted. The balance slowly shifted. German soldiers who had once raced forward now dug in. The psychological impact was profound. Letters from the front reveal a growing sense of exhaustion and disbelief. The lightning war that had promised quick victory had turned into a brutal, endless conflict. Soldiers spoke of fighting an enemy that refused to stay defeated. Meanwhile, Allied observers were watching carefully. Britain and the United States studied Blitzkrieg's successes and failures. They adopted combined arms tactics, improved communication, and emphasized air-ground coordination. But they also noted the vulnerabilities: supply dependence, mechanical strain, and overextension. By 1943, Blitzkrieg no longer dominated the battlefield. At Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, German forces attempted one final massive armored offensive. It was meticulously planned, heavily equipped, and fiercely resisted. Soviet defenses were deep, layered, and prepared. The result was catastrophic. German attacks stalled. Tanks were destroyed in enormous numbers. Air superiority was contested. Speed was replaced by attrition, exactly the kind of warfare Blitzkrieg had been designed to avoid. Kursk marked the end of Blitzkrieg as a decisive offensive. From that point on, German forces fought defensively, reacting rather than dictating the pace. The lightning slowed, then faded. Yet Blitzkrieg's legacy endured. Modern warfare would never again ignore speed, coordination, and communication. Armies around the world absorbed its lessons, adapting them to new technologies and doctrines. Blitzkrieg did not fail because it was flawed. It failed because war itself evolved to resist it. By the end of the Second World War, Blitzkrieg had become both legendary and misunderstood. Popular memory transformed it into a flawless formula for victory, a secret weapon that overwhelmed Europe in a flash. The reality, revealed through documents, testimonies, and battlefield reports, tells a far more complex story. To truly understand Blitzkrieg, it is essential to separate myth from fact. Here are the 20 most interesting and revealing facts about the Blitzkrieg plan, grounded in real historical accounts. Blitzkrieg was never an official, fully written doctrine at the start of the war. The German military did not publish a manual titled Blitzkrieg. The term was popularized by journalists, while German commanders spoke of war of movement. Tanks were not technologically superior in the early years. Many were inferior in armor and firepower, relying instead on coordination and speed. Radios were more important than tank guns. Nearly every German tank had one, allowing instant communication that enemy forces lacked. Blitzkrieg depended on concentration, not numbers. German forces focused power at narrow points rather than spreading it evenly along the front. Air power was tactical, not strategic. The Luftwaffe targeted bridges, headquarters, and supply lines instead of mass civilian bombing during Blitzkrieg operations. Psychological shock was a core weapon. Fear, confusion, and panic were intentionally induced to collapse resistance before full combat occurred. Encirclement was the true objective. Destroying enemy armies mattered more than capturing territory. Blitzkrieg relied heavily on reconnaissance. Fast-moving scouts identified weak points before the main force struck. German logistics were constantly on the brink of collapse. Fuel shortages were a persistent threat, even during major victories.
Captured enemy supplies were routinely used. Blitzkrieg often survived by consuming the resources of defeated armies. Speed replaced rigid planning. Commanders were expected to improvise and exploit opportunities without waiting for permission. Lower-ranking officers held unusual authority. This decentralized command structure accelerated decision-making. Blitzkrieg worked best against rigid command systems. Armies that could not adapt quickly were most vulnerable. Civilian disruption was an unintended but critical factor. Refugees clogged roads, paralyzing enemy movements. Blitzkrieg was extremely risky. If supply lines were cut, armored spearheads could be destroyed. Mechanical failure was a silent enemy. Tanks broke down frequently under constant movement. Blitzkrieg lost effectiveness without air superiority. Once the skies were contested, its momentum faded. Distance was its greatest enemy. Vast territories like the Soviet Union neutralized its speed advantage. Blitzkrieg was not sustainable long-term. It was designed for short wars, not prolonged conflicts. Its greatest weakness was success itself. Early victories created overconfidence and strategic miscalculations. These facts reveal Blitzkrieg not as a miracle weapon, but as a bold, innovative, and dangerous gamble that reshaped warfare. The legacy of Blitzkrieg is undeniable. Modern armies around the world adopted its core principles: combined arms, rapid maneuver, real-time communication, and flexible command structures. From NATO doctrines to modern armored warfare, the DNA of Blitzkrieg remains embedded in military thinking. At the same time, its failures taught equally important lessons.
Speed without logistics leads to collapse. Shock without sustainability fades. No strategy, no matter how brilliant, can overcome every environment or enemy. Veterans who experienced Blitzkrieg from both sides often described it not as chaos, but as relentless pressure. A war that never paused long enough to breathe. A war where confusion spread faster than bullets. For civilians, Blitzkrieg was terrifying precisely because it arrived without warning. One moment life was normal, the next authority vanished, and the future became uncertain. For soldiers, it was exhausting. Victory came at a cost measured not only in casualties, but in physical and mental collapse. In the end, Blitzkrieg did not win the war for Germany, but it changed war forever. It proved that how wars are fought can matter as much as why they are fought, that speed, coordination, and morale could decide battles in days rather than years, and that innovation, once revealed, can never be undone. The lightning war faded, but the thunder still echoes in every modern battlefield. If you made it this far, you now understand Blitzkrieg beyond the myths. You have seen how it was born, how it triumphed, how it failed, and how it reshaped the world. Before you go, leave a comment below telling us what you thought of this documentary. Use the keyword lightning so we know you watched until the very end. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep, real history war documentaries like this one. And keep watching, the next videos are already appearing on your screen now. History never stops moving, neither should you.